What if an army tried to build a modern combat vehicle from tanks that were already considered obsolete? Many military experts believed this project was doomed from the start. Yet the result surprised even its critics. Why did the Swedes install an aircraft cannon on a tracked troop carrier? Which serious weaknesses were hidden behind its success? And why did a vehicle that served for such a short time leave such a big mark on military history? Today we tell the story of the Pansarbandvagn 301, one of Sweden's most unusual armoured vehicles. If you're interested in tanks, secret military projects, and forgotten war machines, be sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. There are many more fascinating stories ahead. Enjoy the video, and let's continue. After the end of the Second World War, Sweden found itself in a rather unusual position. Unlike most European nations, its cities were not in ruins, its industry remained functional, and its army had not suffered the kinds of losses endured by participants in the largest conflict of the 20th century. From the outside, it might have seemed that the country was not threatened and that it did not need to urgently change its armed forces.
However, it was during this period that Swedish military officials began to speak more and more about a problem that was becoming increasingly serious each year. The world was changing rapidly. A new era was arriving to replace the recently concluded war, the era of the Cold War. Large military groupings were forming on both sides of the Baltic Sea, and the development of armoured vehicles was occurring so fast that equipment considered modern just a few years ago began to look obsolete. This was especially true for vehicles designed to transport infantry. The Swedish command carefully studied the experience of the latest military campaigns and reached an unpleasant conclusion. Soldiers could no longer simply be delivered to the front line in trucks or light armoured vehicles and then left to solve all subsequent tasks on their own. Future warfare promised to be much more dynamic and dangerous.
Infantry had to move alongside tanks, traverse difficult terrain, change positions quickly, and remain protected even under heavy enemy fire. Existing troop transport means no longer met these requirements. They had limited cross-country mobility, weak protection, and often could not operate in the same combat formation with modern tanks. Military officials increasingly asked themselves, what would happen if an armed conflict broke out suddenly and the army had to operate under conditions of a rapid enemy offensive? The answers were far from optimistic. Of particular concern was the fact that the potential battlefield for Sweden was an extremely difficult territory. Forests, swamps, numerous lakes, rugged terrain, and a harsh climate imposed special demands on equipment. A vehicle that felt confident on European roads could prove practically useless in the northern regions of the country. That is why Swedish specialists began to look for a solution capable of providing high off-road capability while simultaneously providing reliable protection for the troops. The situation was further complicated by the fact that the military budget could not be called limitless. Developing an absolutely new vehicle required huge expenditures of time and money. At the same time, the command wanted to get results as quickly as possible. The more analysts studied the international situation, the stronger became the feeling that modernization could no longer be postponed. Gradually, an understanding of another important thing formed in military circles. The future belonged not to individual tanks and not to individual infantry, but to their combined actions. Soldiers had to not just follow armoured vehicles, but become part of a single combat system. For this, a new generation vehicle was required, capable of transporting an infantry squad, supporting it with fire, and maintaining mobility even in the most difficult conditions. The search for such a solution turned into one of the most important tasks for the Swedish army in the late 1950s. But the deeper engineers studied possible options, the more obvious it became that creating an ideal machine quickly would not work. Then, the attention of specialists was unexpectedly drawn to equipment that many already considered a relic of the past. Machines that had once been created for a completely different war suddenly got a chance to start a new life in a completely different role. At first glance, the idea looked strange. While many states were investing huge amounts of money in the development of completely new types of equipment, Swedish specialists turned their attention to vehicles that had long been in service and were gradually losing their relevance. This concerned the Stridsvagn M/41 light tanks. Just recently, they had been considered an important part of the country's armored forces, but the development of military technology was proceeding so fast that by the end of the 1950s, their combat capabilities no longer met the new requirements. For the army, a logical problem arose. There were dozens of vehicles in warehouses with working engines, reliable chassis, and a large resource reserve. Simple decommissioning would mean losing significant funds. At the same time, using them as full-fledged tanks was becoming increasingly difficult. The armor looked insufficient by modern standards, the armament was no longer impressive, and the possibilities for modernization were limited. It was then that an idea arose, which subsequently determined the fate of the future project. Instead of sending old vehicles to the scrap heap, engineers proposed completely changing their purpose. It was assumed that only the most valuable elements of the tank structure would remain, and everything else would be rebuilt for completely new tasks. In fact, it was not about modernization, but about a deep remaking, capable of turning an outdated tank into a modern combat vehicle for infantry transport. Such an approach provided several advantages at once. Firstly, the army had the opportunity to significantly reduce costs. Secondly, the timelines for creating new equipment were reduced significantly. Finally, engineers already knew the characteristics of the Stridsvagn M/41 chassis well and understood what loads it could withstand. This allowed them to avoid many problems that usually arise when creating a completely new machine. However, the risk remained enormous. No one could guarantee that the chassis of a tank created in a previous era could effectively perform a completely different role. There was also no certainty about how successful the layout of the future vehicle would turn out to be. Nevertheless, the advantages looked so convincing that the project received support. When the first work began, it became clear that it was about much more serious changes than originally assumed. The designers were practically recreating the internal space of the vehicle from scratch. Everything was done for one goal: to create equipment that would be able to accompany tanks on the battlefield and simultaneously transport a fully equipped infantry squad. Gradually, the future vehicle began to acquire its own appearance. It hardly resembled the tank from which it grew, but the most interesting part was still to come. Swedish military officials did not want to just get armored transport for carrying soldiers. They aimed to create a vehicle that would be able to actively participate in the battle and become a real mobile fortress for the infantry. That is why the designers abandoned many familiar solutions. In those years, most armored personnel carriers were viewed primarily as a means of troop delivery. Their task ended the moment the landing force left the vehicle. Then, the soldiers acted on their own. The Swedish approach turned out to be completely different. The future Pansarbandvagn 301 was created with the expectation that the infantry would maintain combat effectiveness throughout the entire operation. The vehicle had to move quickly over rugged terrain, protect the landing force from shrapnel and small arms fire, and, if necessary, support the soldiers with its own armament. This was no longer just transport, but a full-fledged participant in combat operations. To achieve such goals, the engineers had to seriously rework the hull. The turret of the old tank disappeared, and the interior space was organized anew. The freed-up volume was used to accommodate the landing force. Now several fully equipped soldiers could be inside, ready to leave the vehicle at any moment and enter the battle. Special attention was paid to mobility. Swedish military officials knew the peculiarities of their country perfectly well. Forests, swampy areas, and numerous water barriers required high off-road capability. Therefore, the new vehicle had to move confidently where conventional wheeled vehicles quickly lost efficiency. The tracked base of the old tank provided just such an advantage. But the main difference of the future vehicle was the philosophy of its application. In the army, there was more and more talk that infantry and armored vehicles should act as a single unit. Soldiers were no longer supposed to lag behind tanks or move separately from them. They were supposed to be near the armor from the very beginning of the operation until its conclusion. This idea seemed quite promising, but its implementation required one important element.
The vehicle needed armament capable of not only protecting itself, but also effectively supporting the landing force. And it was here that Swedish designers made a decision that subsequently surprised many military specialists far beyond the country's borders. When work on the new vehicle approached the final design stage, a question arose before the engineers that could determine the success or failure of the entire project. It was necessary to choose the armament. Most armored personnel carriers of that time were equipped with machine guns of various calibers. This was enough for self-defense, but clearly not enough for serious infantry support on the battlefield. Swedish military officials wanted to get much more. The command demanded that the new vehicle could not just transport soldiers, but help them move forward, suppress firing points, and create an advantage in the most dangerous moments of the battle. An ordinary machine gun looked too weak for such a role.
Something more powerful was required, but at the same time compact and light enough for installation on a relatively small vehicle. It was then that the attention of specialists was drawn to a very unusual solution. In the warehouses of the Air Force, there was a large number of AKM/45 20mm automatic aircraft cannons. Once upon a time, they were installed on Swedish fighters and were considered a very effective weapon. However, the development of aviation gradually displaced these systems, and many of them turned out to be unclaimed. Someone suggested using these cannons on the new armored vehicle. At first glance, the idea looked risky. Aviation armament was created for completely different operating conditions. But the calculations showed unexpectedly good results. High rate of fire, powerful ammunition, and an impressive density of fire allowed for a significant increase in the vehicle's combat capabilities compared to traditional armored personnel carriers. After a series of modifications, the aircraft cannon received a new life on the ground. For the crew, this meant the ability to effectively hit light armored vehicles, field fortifications, and enemy manpower. In certain situations, one such vehicle could create a fire effect that previously required the involvement of much more serious support assets. For the early 1960s, such a solution looked very unusual. As a result, the Pansarbandvagn 301 received armament that noticeably distinguished it among many foreign analogues. The vehicle no longer looked like just transport for infantry. It looked more and more like a full-fledged combat complex capable of operating together with tanks and actively participating in combat operations. When the first prototypes were ready, the moment arrived for which engineers, military specialists, and designers had been working for several years. Trials began. It was here that it was necessary to find out whether expectations would be justified or whether the ambitious project would face problems that were impossible to notice in the blueprints. The first checks took place in conditions as close as possible to real operation. The vehicle was driven over rough terrain, taken on forest routes, its capabilities were checked on difficult soil, and the operation of all main systems was evaluated. For the Swedish army, it was especially important to understand whether the new equipment would be able to confidently operate in conditions characteristic of the northern regions of the country. The results immediately attracted the attention of the command. The tracked base provided good off-road capability, and the use of a proven chassis allowed them to avoid many unpleasant surprises. Where wheeled equipment began to experience difficulties, the new vehicle continued to move confidently forward. For an army that expected to conduct operations in wooded and swampy terrain, this was of great importance. No less impressive was the armament. The automatic cannon demonstrated high effectiveness against various targets. Military personnel noted that the firepower of the vehicle noticeably exceeded the capabilities of most armored personnel carriers of that period. In fact, the landing force received not only a means of delivery, but also serious fire support directly on the battlefield. However, trials rarely go perfectly. Already during the first checks, specialists began to notice design features that could affect further operation. Some solutions that seemed successful at the design stage looked less clear in real conditions. While these comments were not perceived as a serious threat to the project, engineers carefully recorded every problem. Nevertheless, the general mood remained positive.
The vehicle demonstrated exactly those qualities that the army had been waiting for many years. It was mobile, had decent protection, could transport infantry, and at the same time independently participate in battle. For the Swedish armed forces, this was an important step forward. Soon it became clear that the project was close to success. But the more carefully specialists studied the test results, the more interesting another question became. How good would this vehicle turn out to be, not on the test range, but in conditions of long service? It was then that the strengths of the Pansarbandvagn 301 began to manifest, which allowed it to occupy a special place in the history of Swedish armoured vehicles. After the completion of the main trials, the Pansarbandvagn 301 gradually began to enter the units of the Swedish army. It was there, far from the test ranges and demonstration runs, that the vehicle had to prove its practical value.
Very quickly, it became clear that some of its advantages looked even more convincing than the developers themselves expected. One of the main merits of the new vehicle turned out to be its mobility. Swedish military officials always paid special attention to the ability of equipment to operate in complex natural conditions. A large part of the country's territory was far from ideal test ranges with smooth roads. Forests, rocky areas, swampy regions, and numerous obstacles constantly tested the equipment for durability. It was here that the tracked base showed its best qualities. The Pansarbandvagn 301 confidently overcame sections that could become a serious problem for wheeled vehicles. This allowed infantry units to maintain a high pace of movement and not lag behind armoured units. For Swedish military doctrine, such a quality was of special importance, as the army sought to ensure the fastest possible response to any threats. No less important an advantage was the possibility of transporting the landing force under the protection of armour. Today, such a thing seems obvious, but in the mid-20th century, not all armies of the world had a sufficient number of such vehicles. Now soldiers could move together with armoured vehicles, remaining protected from shrapnel and small arms fire. This significantly increased their chances of maintaining combat effectiveness until the moment of entering the battle. The vehicle's armament was also highly appreciated. The automatic 20mm cannon turned out to be much more useful than some skeptics assumed. Thanks to the high rate of fire, it worked effectively against light fortifications, unarmored targets, and various objects on the battlefield. In a number of scenarios, such fire support significantly facilitated the actions of the landing force. Military personnel also noted the simplicity of operating many components. The use of a well-studied base facilitated the maintenance of the equipment. Personnel mastered the vehicle faster, and repair units received the opportunity to use previously accumulated experience with similar units. For an army that sought to maintain a high level of readiness, this was a serious advantage. In addition, the very concept of combined actions of infantry and armoured vehicles began to confirm its effectiveness. The Pansarbandvagn 301 became one of those projects that helped the Swedish army move closer to a more modern understanding of mechanised combat. The vehicle was no longer perceived exclusively as transport. It became a full-fledged element of the combat formation. At first glance, it might have seemed that the project turned out to be almost flawless. The military received a protected vehicle with good mobility, powerful armament, and a relatively low cost. However, long-term operation almost always reveals features that cannot be fully evaluated in the early stages of service. Over time, specialists began to pay more and more attention to the limitations that the Pansarbandvagn 301 inherited together with the old tank chassis. It was here that the other side of the decision, which had once allowed to significantly save time and money, gradually manifested itself. The main problem was that the base of the vehicle was created for completely different tasks. The designers did a huge amount of work to adapt the old tank to the new role, but it was impossible to completely get rid of the heritage of the past era. Some limitations were literally built into the design itself. One of the most noticeable shortcomings was the limited internal volume. Despite all the changes to the hull, the space inside remained relatively cramped. For transporting the landing force, this was enough, but the comfort of the crew and soldiers could not be called high. As military technology developed, requirements for ergonomics were constantly growing, and against this background, the vehicle gradually began to look less modern. Additional questions were also raised by the reserve of possibilities for further modernization. While the equipment was just entering service, this did not seem like a serious problem, but soon it became clear that the development of armament, communication systems, and additional equipment would require more and more free space and load-carrying capacity. The old chassis had a certain limit of possibilities which could not be expanded infinitely. There were also limitations related to the level of protection. For its time, the armor provided acceptable security against light weapons and shrapnel. but technologies of anti-tank means were developing rapidly. What looked sufficient today could turn out to be insufficient in just a few years. Military personnel also noted that some technical solutions complicate the further development of the vehicle. A design based on the remaking of an old tank inevitably imposed certain frameworks. Engineers could improve individual elements, but it was becoming more and more difficult to fundamentally change the capabilities of the equipment without creating a completely new platform. Gradually, it became obvious that the Pansarbandvagn 301 represented a very successful compromise, but precisely a compromise. It coped well with many tasks for which it was created, but at the same time, it demonstrated the limits of an approach based on the deep remaking of outdated equipment. And the longer the vehicle was in operation, the more clearly the main question appeared. Would its advantages outweigh the limitations in the long term? Or would the army one day come to the conclusion that even a successful modernization is not capable of holding the equipment at a modern level indefinitely? The longer the Pansarbandvagn 301 was in service, the more clearly the price of a decision that had once seemed almost ideal manifested itself. At the beginning of the project, using old tanks looked like a real find. The army saved significant funds, reduced development timelines, and quickly received new equipment. However, a few years later, it became clear that one still had to pay for such savings. The problem was not in the quality of the vehicle itself. On the contrary, the Pansarbandvagn 301 proved that it was capable of effectively performing assigned tasks. But the development of military technology during the Cold War period was taking place so rapidly that requirements for armored vehicles were changing literally before one's eyes. Each new type of weapon forced a reconsideration of views on protection, mobility, and firepower. More and more often, specialists came to the conclusion that the possibilities of the old chassis were practically exhausted. Any serious modernization required more and more effort. Additional equipment increased the weight of the vehicle, and the design, developed for a light tank of the previous generation, was gradually approaching the limit of its capabilities. At the same time, ideas about the role of mechanized infantry were also changing. Military analysts were more and more actively studying the experience of various armies of the world, and were coming to the conclusion that the future belonged to more perfect combat vehicles, capable of combining high mobility, powerful armament, and improved protection. Against this background, the Pansarbandvagn 301 was already beginning to be perceived as an intermediate solution between the past and the future. This became especially noticeable against the background of new projects appearing in different countries. Designers were more often creating equipment from scratch, not limiting themselves to the framework of old platforms. Such an approach opened up significantly more possibilities for further development. It was then that the Swedish command began to think about the next generation of vehicles. The paradox was that the Pansarbandvagn 301 turned out to be a victim of its own success. It convincingly proved the correctness of the very concept of mechanized infantry, and thus pushed the military to search for even more perfect solutions. The vehicle performed its task so well that the army wanted to get something even more effective. By the mid-1960s, it became obvious that the development of armored vehicles was not standing still.
If at the moment of its appearance, the Pansarbandvagn 301 looked like a modern and promising project, then after a relatively short time, requirements for such equipment increased noticeably. Now the military wanted more internal space better protection, expanded possibilities for modernization, and more perfect armament. The most serious challenge was precisely the rapid obsolescence of concepts. New equipment was appearing faster than before. Military budgets were growing, technologies were being improved, and requirements for vehicle survivability were becoming tougher. In such an environment, even a successful project could very quickly lose its status as advanced. For the Pansarbandvagn 301, this moment came earlier than many expected. The vehicle continued to serve properly, but its potential for development was limited. The army was more and more often facing a situation where further improvement of the existing design was becoming less profitable than creating a completely new model. At the same time, this was not about any failure. On the contrary, the military highly valued the experience gained during the operation of the vehicle. It was precisely this experience that allowed for the formation of requirements for the next generation of equipment. Every identified advantage and every discovered drawback turned into valuable material for future developments. In fact, the Pansarbandvagn 301 became a kind of bridge between two eras. It helped the army understand what a modern armored personnel carrier should be, but at the same time showed the limits of the capabilities of equipment created on the basis of an outdated platform.
While some units continued to successfully use the new machines, in design bureaus, work was already beginning on a project that was destined to determine the future of the Swedish mechanized infantry for many years to come. The appearance of this vehicle became for the Pansarbandvagn 301 simultaneously a recognition of its success and the beginning of the completion of its career. It was about the Pansarbandvagn 302 project. Creating a new vehicle, engineers carefully studied the entire experience of operating the predecessor. They kept successful solutions, but at the same time tried to eliminate the limitations that inevitably arose due to the use of an old tank chassis. Now the design was created from scratch specifically for the role of an infantry fighting vehicle. This opened up completely new possibilities. Internal space increased, the layout was improved, and a greater reserve for modernization appeared. Engineers were no longer forced to adapt to the peculiarities of equipment designed for other tasks decades earlier. When the first information about the new vehicle began to flow into the troops, many specialists immediately understood that the future belonged to it. The Pansarbandvagn 302 did not just develop the ideas of its predecessor, it brought them to a completely different level. For the Pansarbandvagn 301, this meant a gradual retreat to the background. Despite all its advantages, the vehicle could no longer compete with the capabilities of the new platform. The army received exactly what it was striving for from the very beginning: a specialized combat vehicle created without the compromises and limitations of the past. Thus began a process that actually determined the further fate of the first Swedish mass-produced tracked armored personnel carrier. However, even then, few could assume that its story would turn out to be significantly more important than just the story of another vehicle that left the stage after the appearance of a more modern successor. As the Pansarbandvagn 302 entered the troops, the fate of its predecessor was becoming more and more predictable. However, the process of replacement did not happen instantly. The Swedish army traditionally tried to use the already existing equipment as efficiently as possible, especially if it continued to perform assigned tasks properly. Therefore, the Pansarbandvagn 301 still remained an important part of mechanized units for some time. In total, more than 200 such vehicles were built. For the Swedish army of that period, this was a very serious amount. Over the course of several years, they formed the basis of mechanized infantry, and participated in a multitude of exercises during which new tactical methods and ways of interaction between different branches of the armed forces were worked out. Interestingly, most of the vehicles never took part in real combat operations. This was connected not with the shortcomings of the design, but with the peculiarities of the foreign policy of Sweden itself. The country continued to adhere to a course of military neutrality, so the equipment was used primarily to ensure the state's defense capability and to train personnel. Nevertheless, the service of the Pansarbandvagn 301 turned out to be quite eventful. It was on these vehicles that several generations of Swedish military personnel mastered the principles of mechanized combat, which subsequently became a familiar part of army practice. What seems obvious today was only just beginning to be introduced then, and required serious verification in real conditions of operation. Gradually, the vehicles were withdrawn from combat units. Some were used for training purposes, others became a source of spare parts, and some of the equipment was sent to storage. As the number of remaining vehicles decreased, it became more and more obvious that the era of the Pansarbandvagn 301 was coming to an end. Many specimens were eventually dismantled or disposed of. However, it was possible to save several vehicles. Thanks to this, today one can see the Pansarbandvagn 301 in museums and private collections, where they remind one of an important stage in the development of Swedish armoured vehicles. For historians and lovers of military equipment, these vehicles are of special interest, as they allow one to literally touch the period when the army was looking for new ways of developing mechanized troops. At first glance, it might seem that the history of the Pansarbandvagn 301 does not differ from the fate of dozens of other types of equipment that appeared, served for a few years, and were replaced by more modern vehicles. But it is here that the main paradox of the entire project is hidden. If one evaluates the vehicle exclusively by the term of service, one can come to the conclusion that its career turned out to be relatively short. Already a few years after being adopted for service, the army began to actively switch to more perfect equipment. For some projects, such a situation could have been a sign of failure. However, in the case of the Pansarbandvagn 301, everything was completely different. In reality, the vehicle performed a much more important task than simply being in service. It allowed the Swedish army to take a step into a new era. It was precisely thanks to this project that the military gained practical experience in operating new generation tracked armored personnel carriers, was able to test modern tactical concepts, and define requirements for future combat vehicles. Without the Pansarbandvagn 301, its successor would hardly have appeared so quickly and successfully. Engineers gained an invaluable volume of information about which solutions work effectively and which require revision. Every kilometer covered by this vehicle actually became a contribution to the development of the next generation of Swedish armoured vehicles. No less important turned out to be another circumstance. The project proved that even outdated equipment can get a second life with the right approach. The remaking of old tanks allowed Sweden to create, relatively quickly and without excessive costs, a vehicle that for a certain period completely closed the army's needs. For a state with limited resources, such an approach turned out to be quite reasonable and practical. At the same time, the Pansarbandvagn 301 never claimed the role of an ideal vehicle. It was not the most protected armoured personnel carrier of its time. It did not possess record characteristics and did not become a global technological revolution. Its significance lay in something else entirely. It appeared exactly when the army needed it most of all. It allowed for a transition from outdated ideas about mechanized infantry to more modern concepts. It became a testing ground for new ideas, which later received further development in subsequent projects. That is precisely why today, the Pansarbandvagn 301 is viewed not as a temporary improvisation and not as an attempt to save on the development of new equipment. It is increasingly called one of the most important transitional vehicles in the history of the Swedish ground forces. Paradoxically, it is precisely its relatively short service that best demonstrates its success. The vehicle performed its task so effectively that it prepared the ground for the appearance of a more perfect generation of equipment itself. And this constitutes its main legacy. The history of the Pansarbandvagn 301 is a story not about records and not about loud victories.